Some orders break more than rules. They break people. I've spent 12 years documenting military discipline, cataloging the precise mathematics of command and obedience. Chain of command. Clear directives. Clean consequences. But, standing in that field hospital tent, watching Lieutenant Sarah Chen pack her surgical instruments with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, hands that had just saved 3 lives in 18 minutes, I realized my neat little reports meant nothing. The base commander's voice still echoed across the compound, "Get that woman off my field. Now." Her crime? Being better at her job than anyone thought possible. What happened next would make me question everything I thought I knew about courage, about breaking points, and about the difference between following orders and following conscience. Some battles aren't won with weapons. Some victories cost everything. This is the story of a woman who refused to let bureaucracy kill her patients, and the cascade of choices that followed, choices that would ultimately force a decorated base commander to confront what happens when absolute authority meets absolute conviction. I was there. I documented it all. I'm still trying to understand what I witnessed. I keep a small notebook. Black leather, government issue, pages that curl in the heat. Habit from my civilian days as a researcher, document everything, trust memory for nothing. The humidity here makes ink bleed, but I write anyway. Day 47, forward operating base Kestrel. 0630 hours. Lieutenant Sarah Chen moved through the field hospital like water finding its level. Efficient. No wasted motion. I'd been observing medical protocols here for 6 weeks, and she remained the only surgeon who never seemed to pause, never seemed to doubt. This morning was different. The Chinook came in low and fast, rotors chopping the air into visible heat waves. I felt it in my chest before I heard it, the deep thrum that meant incoming wounded. Chen was already moving, surgical gloves snapping into place. "How many?" she called to the medic jogging alongside the stretchers. 3 critical. One's touch and go. Touch and go. Military understatement for dying. The first patient was 19, maybe 20. Shrapnel had turned his abdomen into something that belonged in a forensics textbook. Chen's hands moved without hesitation, finding bleeding, stopping it, moving on. No commentary. No grimace. I positioned myself where I could observe without interfering, my usual spot behind the supply cart. Close enough to document, far enough to stay invisible. That's what I do here. Watch. Record. File reports that disappear into bureaucratic machinery I'll never understand. The tent walls snapped and billowed in the wind. Outside, I could hear the base coming alive, morning patrol reports, helicopter maintenance, the eternal clatter of a military installation that never truly sleeps. Inside, time compressed. Chen worked in silence broken only by requests for instruments, updates on vitals, terse coordination with her team. Corpsman Martinez held retractors. Nurse Collins managed blood pressure. Everyone moved in careful synchronization. The 19-year-old stabilized after 43 minutes. I timed it. The second patient required less dramatic intervention, through bullet wound, clean entry and exit. Routine work, if anything in a field hospital could be called routine. The third patient made Chen pause. A pause. First time I'd seen it. Staff Sergeant Williams, according to his tags. 30s, built like a brick house, unconscious and bleeding from multiple wounds. But it wasn't the wounds that made Chen hesitate. "Jesus," Martinez whispered. Williams wore the insignia of the 82nd Airborne. Same unit as Chen's brother. I know this because I know everything about the people I observe. Chen's personnel file mentioned her brother David Younger, deployed with the 82nd somewhere in the same region. I'd noted it as potential emotional compromise in my reports. Standard psychological evaluation. But, watching her face in that moment, I realized my clinical observations missed something fundamental. Fear. Not for Williams. For what Williams represented, the possibility that the next helicopter could bring news that would shatter her completely. She touched Williams's dog tags. Brief contact, maybe 3 seconds. Then, her hands resumed their work. I wrote, subject displays emotional attachment to patients sharing unit identification with family members. Recommends psychological evaluation. I hate that I wrote that. Chen spent 90 minutes reconstructing Williams's shattered shoulder, repairing nerve damage that could have cost him full use of his arm. Delicate work. Microsurgery performed under field conditions with equipment that belonged in a civilian emergency room, not a combat zone. She saved his shoulder. She probably saved his career. At 0947, as Chen finished suturing Williams's incision, Base Commander Colonel Hayes entered the surgical tent. Hayes looked like Central Casting's idea of a military commander: square jaw, silver hair, posture that suggested ramrods, and pressed uniforms even in 110-degree heat. I'd observed him for 3 weeks. Efficient. Decisive. Zero tolerance for anything that disrupted his perception of proper order. Lieutenant Chen. His voice carried the particular authority that comes from 3 decades of having orders followed immediately and, without question. Chen looked up from her sutures. Sweat had traced clean lines down her dusty cheeks. Yes, sir. I need to speak with you. Outside. Protocol demanded she finish the suturing first. Patient care superseded everything except direct combat situations. Hayes knew this. Chen knew this. Chen set down her instruments. She followed him outside. I followed at a distance, staying within earshot but maintaining professional invisibility. The morning heat hit like opening an oven door. Lieutenant, I've received reports about your conduct. Sir? Hayes's voice carried across the compound's morning bustle: trucks, generators, radio chatter, the constant background hum of military efficiency. You've been making independent decisions regarding patient care that exceed your authority. The Williams case is a perfect example. I checked my notes. Williams, the shoulder reconstruction. Sir, I don't understand. Sergeant Williams required immediate surgical intervention to preserve function in his. You performed a 3-hour surgery without consulting with command about resource allocation. 3 hours. I'd timed it at 90 minutes. Hayes was exaggerating, or he'd been given incorrect information. Chen's posture shifted. Slight straightening, weight transfer to her back foot. Defensive positioning disguised as military bearing. Colonel, with respect, emergency surgical decisions don't require command approval when they fall within standard medical protocols. They do when they consume resources allocated for other purposes. What other purposes, sir? The question hung in the morning heat. Hayes's jaw tightened. That's not your concern, Lieutenant. Your concern is following orders and working within established parameters. My parameters are defined by the Hippocratic Oath and military medical regulations, sir. Both require me to provide optimal care for wounded personnel regardless of what, Lieutenant? Chen paused. 3 seconds. 4. Regardless of convenience, sir. I felt something shift in the space between them. Some invisible line being approached. Hayes stepped closer. Lieutenant Chen, you will confine your surgical activities to emergency stabilization procedures only. Complex reconstructive work will be transferred to the main medical facility at Bagram. Bagram. 90 minutes by helicopter, assuming immediate transport availability. I'd read the statistics. Transfer delays averaged 6 hours. Complex injuries deteriorated rapidly in that time frame. Chen knew the statistics too. Sir, respectfully, that protocol will result in increased morbidity and potential loss of function for patients who could receive definitive care here. That protocol will ensure efficient resource utilization and clear command structure. It will cost people their careers, their mobility, it will maintain order, Lieutenant. The word order fell like a gavel. Chen stared at Hayes for a long moment. Around us, the base continued its morning routines, personnel moving between buildings, vehicles kicking up dust clouds, the distant sound of a helicopter approaching from the south. Is that all, sir? No, Lieutenant. It's not. Hayes glanced toward the surgical tent, where Williams was being moved to recovery. The Williams case represents exactly the kind of independent decision-making that disrupts unit cohesion. You spent 3 hours and significant resources on reconstructive work that could have been handled at a proper facility. Sergeant Williams would have lost functional use of his shoulder. Sergeant Williams would have received appropriate care at Bagram. 6 hours later. With significantly reduced probability of successful reconstruction. With proper resource allocation and chain of command protocols. Chen's hands clenched at her sides. Small movement, quickly controlled. Permission to speak freely, sir. Hayes nodded. Colonel, I took an oath to do no harm. Delaying necessary surgery because of administrative convenience violates that oath. You took an oath to follow orders, Lieutenant. In case you've forgotten, you're a military officer first, doctor second. The words hit Chen like physical blows. I saw her flinch. That's not, she began. That's exactly how it is. And, if you can't understand the distinction, perhaps you're not suited for military medicine. Silence stretched between them. The helicopter I'd heard earlier was getting closer, rotors beating against the morning air. Chen straightened to full attention. I understand the distinction, sir. I also understand my responsibilities to my patients. Your responsibility is to follow orders. My responsibility is to save lives. Your responsibility is whatever I tell you it is. Another helicopter approached from the west. Maybe 2 helicopters. The sound was getting complex, overlapping. Hayes checked his watch. Lieutenant, you will restrict your surgical activities to emergency stabilization only. No complex procedures. No independent resource allocation. Is that understood? Chen's face had gone pale under her tan. Sir, if wounded come in requiring immediate complex surgery, they'll be stabilized and transferred. Some injuries can't wait for transfer. Some orders can't wait for debate. The helicopter sound was definitely multiple aircraft now. Maybe 3. Hayes turned toward the approaching noise, then, back to Chen. Lieutenant, I'm not going to argue military protocol with a junior officer. You have your orders. Follow them, or I'll find someone who will. He walked away, leaving Chen standing in the compound center as dust devils kicked up around her boots. I watched her face change. Something hardened there, like metal cooling after intense heat. The helicopters crested the perimeter wall. 3 Chinooks, flying fast and low. Chen looked at them, then, at Hayes's retreating figure, then, at the surgical tent where her team was cleaning up from the morning's work. She walked back toward the tent. I followed, still maintaining my observational distance. Collins, Chen called to her nurse as she approached the surgical area. Yes, ma'am? How much surgical inventory do we have on hand? Collins consulted her tablet. Full complement, Lieutenant. Restocked yesterday. Good. Chen pulled fresh surgical gloves from the dispenser. Because we're about to need it. The first Chinook touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash. Medics were already running toward it before the engines wound down. Chen positioned herself at the tent's entrance, watching the medics work. Her hands moved unconsciously, flexing and relaxing, preparing for whatever was coming. The medics emerged with stretchers. 4 casualties. Maybe 5. One of the stretchers carried someone who was conscious and screaming. Chen moved. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. 1,047 hours. Multiple incoming casualties. Chen receives direct orders regarding surgical limitations. Question: what happens when orders conflict with oaths? I was about to find out. The screaming patient reached the triage area. 19 years old, Mac's legs twisted at angles that weren't possible without massive fractures. Chen performed rapid assessment. Bilateral femur fractures, probable internal injuries. Get him prepped for surgery. Lieutenant, Collins said quietly. Colonel Hayes's orders. Chen looked at the kid on the stretcher. Looked at Collins. Looked toward Hayes's office across the compound. Prep him for surgery, she repeated. Collins hesitated. Collins. Prep him for surgery. Now. The kid grabbed Chen's arm with surprising strength. Doc, please. My legs. I can't feel my legs. Chen covered his hand with hers. You're going to be fine. We're going to fix this. She looked at Collins. Prep him. Collins moved to follow orders. Chen turned toward the surgical area, then paused. She looked directly at me for the first time since I'd begun observing her. You documenting this? I nodded. Good, she said. Someone should. She disappeared into the surgical tent. I wrote, subject directly acknowledges observation. Suggests awareness of potential consequences for actions. Then, I closed my notebook. Some things shouldn't be reduced to clinical observations. Some things should just be witnessed. Inside the tent, Chen began the process of rebuilding a 19-year-old's shattered legs, using techniques that would take 4 hours and consume resources Hayes had explicitly forbidden her to use. Outside, more helicopters approached on the horizon. The day was just getting started. Day 47, 1,347 hours. Chen 4 hours into unauthorized surgery. The compound's heat had turned vicious. Shade temperature pushing 115, direct sunlight approaching 130. Inside the surgical tent, portable air conditioning units fought a losing battle against the Afghan sun. Chen hadn't emerged once. I positioned myself at a supply station where I could observe both the surgical tent and Hayes's command center. Military efficiency demanded I maintain professional distance, but something about the morning's confrontation made objectivity feel like betrayal. My notebook lay open beside me, pages curling in the heat. Subject continues complex surgery despite direct orders. Duration exceeds authorized parameters by 300%. Sterile language for what amounted to career suicide. The patient, Private Rodriguez, according to his tags, had presented with compound bilateral femur fractures, probable internal bleeding, and loss of sensation below the waist. Standard protocol called for immediate stabilization and transport to Bagram. Hayes's new protocol called for the same thing. Chen's surgical protocol called for immediate reconstruction to prevent permanent paralysis. 3 competing definitions of saving a life. At 13:52, Corpsman Martinez emerged from the surgical tent, sweat staining his uniform in dark patches. He walked directly to the supply area where I was stationed. Sir, you got any more surgical mesh? We're running low. He didn't recognize me as a civilian observer. Fair enough, I'd been embedded here long enough to blend into the background noise of military personnel. I'm not medical staff, I replied. Martinez looked confused, then embarrassed. Sorry, sir. Thought you were. How's the surgery progressing? Martinez glanced back toward the tent. Lieutenant Chen's doing things I've never seen before. Kid came in with legs that looked like they went through a blender, no feeling below his waist. 3 hours ago, I would have bet money he'd never walk again. And, now? Now. Martinez shrugged. She's rebuilding his entire hip structure. Piece by piece. Says if she can restore blood flow to the damaged nerves within the next 2 hours, he's got a 60% chance of full recovery. 60%. Better odds than most people get at anything meaningful. That's remarkable surgical skill. Yes, sir. It is. Martinez lowered his voice. But, the colonel's been asking questions. Wants to know why the surgery's taking so long. What did you tell him? Truth. Complex reconstruction takes time. Martinez headed back toward the surgical tent, then paused. Sir, you mind me asking what you do here? I mean, you're always observing, taking notes, but you're not medical, not command. I showed him my credentials. I document military medical protocols for efficiency assessment. Department of Defense contract. So you're watching us work? Something like that. Martinez nodded slowly. Well, sir, if you're documenting what Lieutenant Chen's doing in there, you should know she's the best surgeon I've ever worked with. And, I've worked with a lot of surgeons. He disappeared back into the tent. I wrote, medical staff display strong confidence in Chen's abilities. Morale appears unaffected by command tensions. At 14:07, Hayes appeared at the command center's entrance, talking intensely with Major Peterson, his executive officer. Both men looked in the direction of the surgical tent. Hayes gestured sharply. Peterson nodded and headed across the compound toward the surgical tent. I closed my notebook and followed at a discreet distance. Peterson entered the surgical area just as Chen was calling for more hemostats. The tent's interior felt like a pressure cooker, surgical lights adding heat to an already oppressive environment. Lieutenant Chen. Chen looked up from Rodriguez's open abdomen. Sweat dripped from her face despite the surgical mask. Major Peterson. Is this urgent? I'm at a critical junction with this reconstruction. Colonel Hayes requests an immediate status update. Patient is stable. Reconstruction proceeding normally. Estimated completion in 2 hours. Peterson consulted his tablet. Lieutenant, this surgery began at 10:47. It's now past 1400. That's over 3 hours of surgery time. Complex orthopedic reconstruction requires authorization, Lieutenant. Which you don't have. Chen's hands paused for maybe 2 seconds. Then, resumed their work. Major, with respect, I have authorization under military medical regulations to provide necessary care for critical patients. You have authorization for emergency stabilization. This is emergency stabilization. Peterson looked at Rodriguez's open surgical site, the complex array of pins and plates Chen was installing, the sophisticated reconstruction taking place in real time. This looks like elective surgery, Lieutenant. This looks like the difference between this soldier walking again or spending his life in a wheelchair. Peterson studied his tablet again. Colonel Hayes wants to see you immediately. I'll be available as soon as I complete this procedure. He wants to see you now, Lieutenant. Chen placed her instruments on the surgical tray and looked directly at Peterson. Major, are you ordering me to abandon a patient in the middle of critical surgery? The question hung in the tense, stifling air. Peterson's face flushed red beneath his tan. Around us, medical equipment hummed and beeped, Rodriguez's vital signs painting electronic landscapes across monitor screens. I'm relaying Colonel Hayes's direct orders. Then, relay this back to Colonel Hayes. I will report to him immediately upon completion of this surgery. Abandoning a patient during a critical procedure violates every medical protocol and regulation in existence. It also violates direct orders from your commanding officer. Some violations are worse than others, Major. Peterson stared at her for a long moment. I could see him calculating military discipline versus medical ethics, chain of command versus professional responsibility. How long until completion? 2 hours, maximum. That's unacceptable. Chen returned to her work, hands moving with steady precision through Rodriguez's complex internal reconstruction. Major, you're welcome to explain to Rodriguez's family why we left him paralyzed rather than violate administrative convenience. Peterson's jaw tightened. Lieutenant, you're walking a very thin line. I'm rebuilding a soldier's spine, Major. I'll worry about lines later. Peterson left the tent without another word. I followed him outside, maintaining enough distance to observe his destination. He headed directly back to Hayes's command center. 30 seconds later, Hayes emerged from the building, moving with the purposeful stride that preceded disciplinary action. I opened my notebook. 1,423 hours. Command confrontation imminent. Chen refuses orders to abandon surgery. Hayes entered the surgical tent like a military storm system. Lieutenant Chen. His voice cut through the medical equipment's electronic symphony. Chen didn't look up from Rodriguez's reconstruction. Colonel, I'll be with you as soon as I complete this critical junction. You'll be with me now. Chen's hands continued their precise work. Sir, I cannot abandon this patient during active surgery. You can and you will. Chen placed her instruments on the surgical tray and turned to face Hayes. Her surgical mask couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. Colonel, requesting permission to complete this surgery before reporting. Permission denied. Corpsman Martinez can handle the closure. Martinez stepped forward. Sir, this isn't closure work. Lieutenant Chen is performing spinal nerve reconstruction. I'm not qualified. Then, stabilize the patient and prep him for transport to Bagram. Chen removed her surgical gloves with deliberate precision. Sir, transporting Rodriguez in his current condition will result in permanent paralysis. The nerve reconstruction is at a critical stage. The nerve reconstruction is unauthorized. The nerve reconstruction will let this soldier walk again. The nerve reconstruction violates direct orders. Chen stared at Hayes across Rodriguez's open surgical site. Around them, medical equipment continued its electronic monitoring, indifferent to the human drama playing out above the unconscious patient. Sir, I took an oath. You took orders. Some oaths supersede orders. Hayes stepped closer to the surgical table. Lieutenant, you seem to be under the impression that your medical degree grants you special authority. Let me clarify, you are a military officer. You follow orders. Period. I'm a doctor. You're whatever I say you are. The words fell like physical blows. Chen looked at Rodriguez, unconscious and vulnerable on the surgical table. Looked at Martinez, whose face reflected helpless frustration. Looked back at Hayes. Sir, this surgery will save Rodriguez's ability to walk. 2 more hours of unauthorized resource consumption. 2 more hours of reconstructive surgery that could give a 19-year-old his life back. 2 more hours of insubordination that could cost you your career. Chen pulled off her surgical cap, revealing hair matted with sweat. Some things are worth a career, sir. Hayes's face flushed dark red. Step away from the patient, Lieutenant. Chen didn't move. Lieutenant Chen, I am giving you a direct order. Step away from the patient and report to my office immediately. Chen looked at Rodriguez again. Looked at the complex reconstruction work still remaining. Looked at Martinez, who couldn't complete what she'd started. Sir, requesting permission to complete denied. Sir, this patient will lose, Lieutenant. Hayes's voice echoed through the surgical tent like a gunshot. You will step away from that table. You will report to my office. You will do both immediately. Is that understood? Chen stood motionless for 10 seconds. 15. 20. Then, she stepped away from the surgical table. Martinez, keep him stable. Monitor his vitals. Do not let anyone transport him until I return. Martinez nodded. Chen followed Hayes toward the tent's exit, then paused. Colonel? Hayes turned back. When Rodriguez wakes up paralyzed, when he spends the rest of his life in a wheelchair because we chose administrative convenience over medical necessity, how are you going to explain that to his family? I'm going to explain that his surgeon disobeyed orders and compromised his care. Chen stared at him for a long moment. Yes, sir. I suppose you are. She followed Hayes out of the surgical tent, leaving Rodriguez unconscious and incomplete on the surgical table. I watched them cross the compound toward Hayes's office, Chen's surgical scrubs dark with sweat, Hayes's uniform pristine despite the oppressive heat. Inside the tent, Martinez stood helplessly beside Rodriguez's open surgical site, monitoring equipment beeping steadily in the background. I opened my notebook. 1,441 hours. Chen ordered to abandon surgery. Patient Rodriguez remains in critical surgical state. Then, I closed it. Some situations defy clinical documentation. Some moments require witness, not analysis. Across the compound, Hayes's office door slammed shut. Whatever happened next would determine whether Rodriguez walked again. And whether Chen remained in the army at all. I waited. The heat pressed down like judgment itself. Day 47, 1,502 hours. Chen confined to Hayes's office, Rodriguez deteriorating. Hayes's office was a study in military precision, clean lines, organized files, photographs of ceremonies and commendations arranged with geometric exactness. Air conditioning kept the space comfortable while the rest of the base baked in 117-degree heat. I positioned myself at a supply desk 30 meters away, close enough to observe foot traffic and activity without appearing to eavesdrop. The conversation inside remained inaudible, but body language told its own story through the office's window. Hayes behind his desk, posture rigid. Chen standing at attention, surgical scrubs still damp with sweat. Both figures motionless except for Hayes's occasional gestures, sharp, definitive movements that punctuated whatever points he was making. My notebook lay open beside me, but I found myself unable to write. Clinical observation felt inadequate for what I was witnessing, the collision between two incompatible definitions of duty. At 15:17, Major Peterson entered the office carrying a thick folder. Personnel file. Chen's career history, medical school records, performance evaluations, disciplinary notes, everything that defined her professional existence reduced to bureaucratic documentation. The meeting continued. At 15:23, Martinez appeared at my supply station, his face grim. "Sir, Rodriguez is deteriorating. Blood pressure's dropping, and I can see swelling around the surgical site. We need to get him back into surgery." I glanced toward Hayes's office. The meeting showed no signs of concluding. "Can you handle the necessary procedures?" Martinez shook his head. "What Lieutenant Chen was doing, spinal nerve reconstruction, I've never seen anything like it. I can keep him stable, maybe, but if that swelling increases..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Brain swelling. Permanent paralysis. Possible death. How long can you maintain him? Maybe an hour. Maybe less. Martinez headed back to the surgical tent, moving with the controlled urgency that military medical personnel develop, fast enough to respond to crisis, slow enough to avoid panic. I watched him disappear into the tent, then turned back to Hayes's office. The conversation inside appeared to be intensifying. Hayes was standing now, leaning forward across his desk. Chen remained at attention, but her posture had shifted, weight slightly forward, jaw set in the particular way that suggested someone preparing for impact. At 15:34, Peterson emerged from the office and headed toward the communications building. Calling higher command. Chen's situation was escalating beyond base-level authority. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Peterson contacting regional command. Disciplinary action proceeding to higher authority." At 15:41, Martinez reappeared at my station. "Sir, Rodriguez's condition is deteriorating rapidly. I need Lieutenant Chen back in surgery immediately." I looked toward Hayes's office. The meeting continued. "Have you informed Colonel Hayes?" I sent word through Peterson. No response yet. Martinez's hands were shaking slightly, barely visible, but there. Combat medics don't shake unless the situation is genuinely desperate. How desperate is Rodriguez's condition? Martinez checked his watch. If we don't relieve the pressure on his spinal cord within the next 30 minutes, the nerve damage will be permanent. And if the swelling spreads, brainstem compression? Martinez nodded. Rodriguez could die. The words hung between us in the oppressive heat. A 19-year-old soldier was dying because two officers couldn't agree on the definition of proper medical care. At 15:47, Hayes's office door opened. Chen emerged first, her face pale but composed. Hayes followed, his expression set in the particular mask that senior officers wear when making decisions they know will be questioned. Chen walked directly toward the surgical tent. Hayes headed toward the communications building. I followed Chen, maintaining observational distance but abandoning any pretense of clinical detachment. Chen entered the surgical tent where Rodriguez lay unconscious, surrounded by monitoring equipment that painted increasingly urgent electronic warnings across multiple screens. Martinez, status. Lieutenant, he's in bad shape. Blood pressure's critically low, spinal swelling is increasing, and I'm seeing signs of brainstem compression. Chen moved to Rodriguez's bedside with the focused intensity of someone who understood they were working against time measured in minutes, not hours. Prep him for immediate surgery. Martinez hesitated. Lieutenant, Colonel Hayes's orders. Chen looked at Martinez with exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. Martinez, Rodriguez is dying. I can save him, but I need to start surgery immediately. Ma'am, if you violate Hayes's direct orders, if I don't violate Hayes's direct orders, Rodriguez dies. Chen began surgical preparation with mechanical precision, hands washing, gown and gloves, instrument check. Every movement economical, practiced, urgent. Martinez, are you going to help me save Rodriguez's life, or are you going to watch him die for administrative reasons? Martinez stared at her for a moment, then began preparing surgical instruments. What do you need, Lieutenant? Chen positioned herself at Rodriguez's surgical site. The earlier reconstruction work had been interrupted mid-procedure, leaving complex spinal hardware partially installed, nerve pathways exposed, critical connections incomplete. I need you to monitor his vitals and hand me instruments. And I need you to understand that both of us are probably ending our military careers right now. Martinez checked Rodriguez's blood pressure. His pressure's continuing to drop. Chen made her first incision, returning to the complex reconstruction work she'd been forced to abandon 3 hours earlier. Then, we'd better make it count. At 15:53, as Chen worked to relieve pressure on Rodriguez's spinal cord, Hayes entered the surgical tent accompanied by Master Sergeant Williams and 2 military police officers. The presence of MPs meant formal disciplinary action. Arrest. Court-martial. The end of Chen's military career, and, possibly her medical career. Hayes approached the surgical table where Chen continued working on Rodriguez's exposed spine. Lieutenant Chen. Chen didn't look up from her work. Colonel, I'm at a critical junction with this procedure. Lieutenant, you are under arrest for failure to obey direct orders, conduct unbecoming an officer, and misappropriation of military resources. Chen's hands continued their precise work inside Rodriguez's spinal column. Colonel, this patient will die if I stop this surgery. This patient will receive appropriate care at Bagram Medical Facility. This patient won't survive transport to Bagram. Hayes gestured to the MPs. Sergeant Williams, place Lieutenant Chen under arrest. Williams approached the surgical table, then paused. He looked at Rodriguez's unconscious form, at the complex surgical work Chen was performing, at the monitoring equipment showing increasingly critical vital signs. Sir, the lieutenant's in the middle of surgery. The lieutenant is in violation of direct orders. Sir, if we interrupt this surgery. Sergeant, I gave you an order. Williams looked at Hayes, then at Chen, then at Rodriguez. Sir, requesting permission to allow Lieutenant Chen to complete the surgery before arrest procedures. Permission denied. The surgery ends now. Chen placed her instruments on the surgical tray and looked directly at Hayes. Colonel, if you arrest me now, Rodriguez dies. If you let me finish this surgery, Rodriguez lives. Everything else is just paperwork. Everything else is military discipline. Everything else is the difference between a soldier going home to his family or going home in a box. Hayes stared at Chen across Rodriguez's open surgical site. You seem to think medical necessity trumps military authority, Lieutenant. I think human life trumps bureaucracy. Human life depends on military order. Without discipline, without chain of command, soldiers die. Without medical care, soldiers die too. Medical care happens within proper channels. Proper channels let Rodriguez die. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying Chen's face. Lieutenant, you forced me into an impossible position. I cannot allow insubordination, regardless of motivation.
Colonel, you forced me into an impossible position. I cannot allow a patient to die, regardless of orders.
Your patient will receive care at Bagram. My patient will die en route to Bagram.
Martinez spoke quietly from his position monitoring Rodriguez's vitals. Sir, his blood pressure is critical.
If we transport him now. Hayes turned to Martinez. Your medical opinion, corpsman? Martinez glanced at Chen, then, back to Hayes.
Sir, Rodriguez won't survive transport.
The spinal swelling is too severe. Lieutenant Chen is the only person here qualified to relieve the pressure. Hayes studied Rodriguez's unconscious form, the surgical monitoring equipment, the complex reconstruction work Chen had begun. How long to complete the surgery? Chen looked at Rodriguez's exposed spinal column, calculating the remaining work. 90 minutes, maximum. Hayes checked his watch. 1,604 hours.
Sergeant Williams, you and your men will remain here during the surgery. Lieutenant Chen will complete her work, then submit to arrest procedures.
Williams nodded. Yes, sir. Hayes turned back to Chen. You have 90 minutes, Lieutenant.
Use them wisely. He left the surgical tent, leaving Chen under guard but free to continue the surgery that would determine whether Rodriguez lived or died.
Chen returned to her work immediately, hands moving with practiced precision through Rodriguez's complex spinal reconstruction. Martinez, monitor his pressure. This is going to be close.
I positioned myself where I could observe the entire scene, Chen working desperately to save Rodriguez's life, MP's standing guard over a surgeon performing what might be her final surgery, equipment monitoring the vital signs of a 19-year-old whose life hung in the balance of politics and medicine. At 16:11, Rodriguez's blood pressure spiked dangerously high.
Martinez, he's in crisis.
Pressure's 190/110 and climbing. Chen worked faster, her movements becoming more urgent as Rodriguez's condition deteriorated.
Come on, Rodriguez. Stay with me. At 16:18, the pressure began to stabilize. Pressure's dropping. 160/95.
Chen continued the delicate work of reconstructing Rodriguez's spinal column, piece by piece rebuilding the complex nerve pathways that would determine whether he ever walked again.
Martinez, prep the final surgical hardware. Yes, ma'am. At 16:34, Chen began the closing procedures. Rodriguez's vital signs had stabilized. The spinal reconstruction was complete.
At 16:47, Chen stepped away from the surgical table.
Surgery complete. Patient stable.
She removed her surgical gloves and turned to Sergeant Williams.
I'm ready. Williams approached with handcuffs.
Lieutenant Sarah Chen, you are under arrest for failure to obey direct orders, conduct unbecoming an officer, and misappropriation of military resources.
You have the right to remain silent.
As Williams read Chen her rights, Rodriguez's monitoring equipment painted steady, stable vital signs across electronic displays.
Alive. Stable. Walking again, if the surgery was successful.
Chen submitted to arrest procedures without resistance, her exhausted face showing something that looked almost like relief. As the MPs escorted her across the compound toward the detention facility, I opened my notebook.
1,653 hours. Chen arrested following completion of unauthorized surgery. Patient Rodriguez stable.
Then, I closed the notebook and followed the small procession across the compound.
Some things couldn't be reduced to clinical observation. Some moments demanded witness, not documentation. Rodriguez was alive. Chen was under arrest. Everything else was still to be determined. Day 52, 0800 hours. 5 days since Chen's arrest.
The base detention facility was a converted storage building, concrete walls, minimal air conditioning, fluorescent lights that hummed incessantly. I've been granted permission to interview Chen as part of my documentation process, though I suspect Hayes approved the meeting more to gather intelligence than to facilitate research. Chen sat across from me at a metal table bolted to the floor, wearing standard-issue detention uniform instead of surgical scrubs. 5 days of confinement had hollowed her cheeks slightly, but her eyes remained alert, focused. "How's Rodriguez?" she asked before I could start my questions.
"Stable. Martinez says he's responding well to physical therapy. Early indications suggest the surgery was successful."
Chen nodded, some tension leaving her shoulders.
"Good. That's good." I opened my notebook. "I wanted to ask you about the decision-making process that led to, do you know what Rodriguez said when he woke up?" I looked up from my notes.
Chen was staring at the concrete wall behind me.
He said, "Doc, can I still play basketball?"
Kid's 19 years old, survived an IED explosion that should have killed him, and he's worried about basketball. Chen's voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue.
I told him yes.
Based on the reconstruction work, assuming proper rehabilitation, he should regain full mobility.
That must have been rewarding.
Chen laughed, but there was no humor in it.
Rewarding. Sure.
Rodriguez gets to play basketball, and I get to spend the next 5 to 10 years in federal prison for violating military orders. You knew the potential consequences when you continued the surgery. I knew Rodriguez would die if I didn't continue the surgery.
Chen met my eyes directly. "Let me ask you something.
You've been observing us for weeks, documenting our procedures, our decisions.
In all your research, have you ever encountered a situation where following orders would result in someone's death?" I considered the question. Military personnel face life and death decisions regularly. Chain of command exists specifically to, that's not what I asked. Chen leaned forward.
I asked if you'd ever encountered a situation where the right choice and the legal choice were different things.
I document procedures, not ethics. Everything we do is ethics.
Every decision, every protocol, every report you write, it's all ethics disguised as procedure. The detention facility's air conditioning kicked in, humming against the morning heat.
"What would you have done?" Chen asked. "In my position, with Rodriguez dying on the table and Hayes ordering you to walk away?" I closed my notebook. "I don't know." "Yes, you do. You've been taking notes for weeks. You've seen how we work, what we deal with, the decisions we make every day. What would you have done?" The question hung between us in the fluorescent-lit space. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Heavy boots, multiple people. The door opened to admit Hayes, Major Peterson, and a woman I didn't recognize, a colonel with medical insignia and the bearing of someone accustomed to making final decisions. "Lieutenant Chen," Hayes said. "Colonel Martinez from Regional Medical Command." Chen stood at attention. "Ma'am."
Colonel Martinez studied Chen with the expression of someone evaluating a complex problem.
"Lieutenant, I've reviewed your case file, the incident reports, and the medical documentation from Rodriguez's surgery." Martinez opened a folder and consulted several pages of typed reports. "Your surgical technique shows exceptional skill. The spinal reconstruction you performed under field conditions would be challenging in a civilian hospital with full resources." "Thank you, ma'am."
However, your violation of direct orders represents a serious breach of military discipline.
"Chain of command isn't a suggestion, Lieutenant.
It's the foundation of military effectiveness." Chen remained at attention, but I could see her jaw tighten.
Martinez continued reading from the folder.
"Colonel Hayes has recommended court-martial proceedings for insubordination and misappropriation of military resources." She closed the folder and looked directly at Chen. "Before I make my decision on those recommendations, I want to hear your explanation for your actions." Chen was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully.
"Ma'am, I took an oath to do no harm. When following orders would result in preventable death or permanent disability, that oath takes precedence. Military officers take multiple oaths, Lieutenant, including obedience to lawful orders." "I understand that, ma'am."
But, some situations require choosing which oath matters more.
Martinez glanced at Hayes, whose face remained impassive. Lieutenant, explain to me why you believe medical judgment should supersede military authority. Chen straightened slightly. Ma'am, it's not about superseding authority.
It's about understanding that authority serves a purpose, protecting and preserving human life. When authority conflicts with that purpose, something's wrong.
Who decides what's wrong, Lieutenant? Individual officers making personal judgments? Medical professionals making medical decisions, ma'am. Hayes spoke for the first time since entering the room.
Colonel Martinez, this is exactly the attitude that created this situation.
Lieutenant Chen believes her medical training grants her special authority to ignore orders. Martinez held up a hand. Colonel Hayes, I'll hear your perspective shortly. She turned back to Chen. Lieutenant, walk me through your decision-making process during the Rodriguez case.
Chen recounted the surgery in precise detail, Rodriguez's injuries, the time-sensitive nature of spinal reconstruction, the deteriorating conditions that made transport to Bagram impossible. Based on medical evidence, transport would have resulted in permanent paralysis or death. Based on your medical judgment. Based on documented medical research regarding spinal trauma and transport mortality rates. Martinez nodded. I've reviewed that research. Your assessment appears accurate. Hayes stepped forward. Colonel, medical accuracy isn't the issue. Military discipline is the issue. Martinez looked at Hayes. Colonel, explain your position. Hayes squared his shoulders. Colonel, if we allow individual officers to ignore orders based on personal judgment, military effectiveness collapses. Chain of command must be absolute. Even when following orders results in preventable casualties? Following orders prevents casualties by maintaining organizational structure and resource allocation. Lieutenant Chen's unauthorized surgery consumed resources that might have been needed for other patients. Martinez consulted her folder again. According to medical records, no other critical patients required surgery during Rodriguez's procedure. That's irrelevant. Resource allocation decisions belong to command authority, not individual officers. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, studying both Hayes and Chen. Colonel Hayes, in your opinion, what should have happened to Rodriguez? Rodriguez should have been stabilized and transported to Bagram Medical Facility for appropriate care. Despite the high probability of permanent paralysis? Despite the violation of proper protocol? Martinez turned to Chen. Lieutenant, in your opinion, what should have happened? Ma'am, Rodriguez required immediate surgical intervention to preserve neurological function. The surgery I performed gave him the best chance of full recovery. Despite violating direct orders? Chen hesitated for a moment. Ma'am, some things are more important than orders. Hayes's face flushed red. Colonel Martinez, that statement alone justifies court-martial proceedings. Martinez closed her folder and stood. I'll render my decision shortly. In the meantime, Lieutenant Chen will remain in detention. She headed toward the door, then paused. Colonel Hayes, I'd like to speak with you privately. Hayes followed Martinez out, leaving Chen alone with Peterson and myself. Peterson studied his tablet uncomfortably. Lieutenant, for what it's worth, Rodriguez is doing well. Physical therapy reports show excellent progress. Chen nodded. Thank you, sir. 20 minutes later, Martinez and Hayes returned. Both officers' expressions were carefully neutral. Martinez addressed Chen directly. Lieutenant, I've made my decision regarding court-martial proceedings. Chen stood at attention. After reviewing all evidence, consulting with medical experts, and considering the unique circumstances of this case, I've decided not to pursue court-martial. Hayes's face went pale. Colonel, with respect, Martinez held up a hand. However, Lieutenant Chen, your violation of direct orders cannot go without consequence. She opened a new folder and read from an official document. You will receive a formal reprimand in your personnel file.
You will be transferred from combat medical duty to a stateside teaching position at Fort Sam Houston Medical Training Center.
Chen's relief was visible, but tempered.
Ma'am, is this transfer permanent?
That depends on your performance in your new assignment and your ability to work within proper command structure.
Martinez turned to Hayes. Colonel, you will modify base medical protocols to include provisions for complex emergency surgery when transport is not viable. Hayes's jaw tightened. Ma'am, that undermines command authority over resource allocation. That prevents future situations where medical necessity conflicts with administrative protocol. Martinez gathered her folders. Both of you will submit detailed reports on this incident for inclusion in revised medical protocols. This case will serve as precedent for similar situations. She headed toward the door, then stopped. Lieutenant Chen, you saved Rodriguez's life. That matters.
But military medicine requires balancing individual medical judgment with broader organizational needs. Learn that balance, and you'll be an exceptional military surgeon.
She turned to Hayes.
Colonel, military effectiveness depends on mission success.
Sometimes that means adapting protocols to support the mission rather than enforcing them for their own sake.
After Martinez and Peterson left, Hayes and Chen faced each other across the detention facility's stark interior.
Hayes spoke first. Lieutenant, you put me in an impossible position. Sir, you put Rodriguez in an impossible position.
Hayes was quiet for a moment. Rodriguez is alive because of your surgical skill.
Rodriguez is alive because medical necessity took precedence over administrative convenience.
Rodriguez is alive because I chose not to court-martial a skilled surgeon for saving a soldier's life.
Chen looked surprised. Sir? Hayes's official mask slipped slightly. Lieutenant, did you really think I was going to let you go to prison for keeping one of my soldiers alive? Sir, I don't understand.
Hayes sat down across from Chen, suddenly, looking older than his 50-something years.
Chen, you've been under observation since you arrived here. Your surgical outcomes are exceptional. Your dedication to patient care is absolute. Your respect for military protocol is non-existent? Complicated.
Hayes rubbed his temples.
Do you know what my primary responsibility is as base commander? Maintaining military discipline. Bringing everyone home alive.
Chen stared at him. Every decision I make, every protocol I enforce, every order I give, it's all designed to maximize the chances that every person on this base goes home to their families.
Hayes gestured toward the detention facility's walls. Sometimes that means enforcing discipline even when it seems counterproductive. Sometimes it means fighting bureaucracy to protect people who challenge my authority. Sir, I don't understand. Hayes smiled grimly. Chen, do you think Colonel Martinez made her decision independently? I assumed. I recommended against court-martial. I recommended the teaching transfer. I recommended the protocol modifications. Chen's mouth opened slightly. You saved Rodriguez's life.
But, more importantly, you demonstrated that our medical protocols had dangerous gaps.
You forced me to confront the difference between administrative efficiency and medical effectiveness. Hayes stood and walked toward the door. Chun, you're being released immediately. Report to Major Peterson for transfer arrangements.
He paused at the door.
And, Chen? Next time you think medical necessity requires breaking orders, try talking to me first. You might be surprised. Hayes left, leaving Chen alone in the detention facility.
She looked at me with expression that mixed exhaustion, relief, and complete bewilderment.
Did that really just happen? I closed my notebook. What part? Any of it. All of it. Chen shook her head. 5 days ago I thought my career was over.
5 days ago Rodriguez thought his life was over.
Chen nodded slowly. Yeah, he did.
She stood and gathered the few personal items she'd been allowed in detention.
You know what the strangest part is? What? Hayes was right about talking to him first. If I'd explained the medical situation instead of just doing what I thought was right, would you have changed anything? Chen considered the question as we walked toward the detention facility's exit. No. Rodriguez needed that surgery, and he needed it immediately. But maybe there was a way to save his life without ending my career. Your career didn't end. My combat medical career did. Teaching assignment means no more field surgery. We stepped outside into the afternoon heat.
The base continued its routine operations, personnel moving between buildings, vehicles raising dust clouds, helicopters approaching from the south.
Is that such a bad thing? I asked.
Chen looked around the compound, taking in the surgical tent where she'd spent the last several weeks, the command center where Hayes had ordered her arrest, the landing zone where wounded soldiers arrived daily.
I don't know, she said finally. Ask me in a year. Day 67, Final Report. 2 weeks later, I submitted my final documentation to the Department of Defense.
15 pages of clinical observations, protocol analysis, and efficiency recommendations. I never mentioned Chen's courage.
I never mentioned Hayes's impossible position. I never mentioned Rodriguez asking about basketball. Some things can't be reduced to bureaucratic language. Some stories resist documentation. 3 months later, I received a message from Chen at Fort Sam Houston.
She was teaching combat surgical techniques to new military surgeons.
Her classes were oversubscribed. Rodriguez had returned to full duty. He was playing basketball again.
Hayes had been promoted to regional command.
The medical protocols had been modified to allow complex emergency surgery when transport wasn't viable. My report was filed and forgotten.
But, sometimes, late at night, I think about Chen standing over Rodriguez's surgical table, choosing between orders and oaths.
I think about Hayes recommending clemency for the officer who challenged his authority. I think about Rodriguez asking about basketball.
And I wonder if the most important things that happen in war are the ones that never make it into official reports.
Some battles aren't fought with weapons. Some victories can't be measured in strategic objectives. Some courage looks exactly like insubordination. Until you understand what's really at stake. End of documentation. End of story.